In a controlled experiment, participants were given a choice between a guaranteed $50 and a 50% chance of winning $100. Most chose the guaranteed amount. Then the framing was reversed, a guaranteed loss of $50 versus a 50% chance of losing $100. The percentage who chose to gamble jumped dramatically. The math was identical. The human was not. That asymmetry is not a quirk. It is not a cognitive glitch that education corrects. It is a structural feature of how the human animal encodes value, and it has been running inside the subject's decision architecture since long before the subject had language to describe decisions at all. Kahneman and Tversky began designing their prospect theory experiments in the 1970s with a reasonable assumption that rational actors would weigh equivalent probabilities equivalently. The dominant economic model of the era, expected utility theory, rested on a premise so clean it had the elegance of mathematics. A $50 swing in either direction, the model predicted, should carry the same psychological weight. Humans were assumed to be instruments of calibrated preference, balancing potential outcomes with something approaching precision. What the researchers were testing was not whether humans were irrational. They were testing whether humans were even within the same conceptual neighborhood as the rational agent that entire economic systems had been built to describe. What they found required the construction of an entirely new theoretical framework, because the existing one had no room for what the data showed. The numbers, when they arrived, were specific enough to be uncomfortable. Losses are psychologically weighted approximately 2 to 2.5 times more powerfully than equivalent gains. Not slightly more, not marginally more, roughly twice as powerfully. The unit of psychological pain generated by losing $100 is not the same unit, inverted as the pleasure generated by gaining $100. They are not mirror images, they are different magnitudes measured on an asymmetric scale that the organism did not choose and cannot consciously override. In medical research, when a surgical procedure was described to physicians as having a 90% survival rate, recommendation patterns differed significantly from when the identical procedure was described as carrying a 10% mortality rate. The information was not different, the framing was, and the behavior of trained medical professionals, people whose entire professional formation is built around objective assessment, shifted in measurable, documented ways. In investment studies, participants held losing positions far longer than winning ones at statistically irrational rates. They were not making calculated bets. They were avoiding the finality of a registered loss. The mechanism beneath this is what prospect theory calls the value function, and understanding it requires setting aside the metaphor of a balanced scale. The brain does not evaluate outcomes in absolute terms. It evaluates outcomes relative to a reference point, an internal anchor that represents the status quo, the baseline the organism has implicitly claimed as its own. From that anchor, gains are processed along a curve that diminishes in sensitivity. The difference between gaining $10 and gaining $20 feels significant, but the difference between gaining $110 and $120 feels smaller, even though the increment is identical. The curve flattens as gains accumulate, but losses do not mirror this geometry. The loss curve descends more steeply. Each unit of loss below the reference point registers with greater intensity than the corresponding unit of gain registered above it. The asymmetry is not in the outcome, it is in the architecture of the function itself. The endowment effect is where this mechanism becomes visible on the surface of social behavior. Once the brain has categorized something as possessed, an object, a position, a relationship, a belief, its potential absence is no longer processed as an opportunity cost. It is processed as a threat to the continuity of self. The object has been incorporated into the reference point. Losing it now feels less like failing to gain and more like being diminished. The neurological substrate for this is the amygdala's differential response to threat anticipation versus reward anticipation. Loss anticipation activates threat processing circuitry at roughly twice the functional intensity of equivalent gain anticipation. Activating reward circuitry. This is not a metaphor for emotional distress. It is a measurable differential in the architecture of response. The organism is not being dramatic. It is running exactly the program it was built to run. Now consider where you do this, not in abstract experimental conditions, in the specific, unremarkable geography of an ordinary life. In the negotiation where you accepted a worse outcome because holding the line felt like risking a loss, and losing ground felt existentially different from failing to gain it. In the relationship, you remained inside past the point where the cost of staying had exceeded the cost of leaving, but leaving had been categorized as loss, and staying, however expensive, preserved the reference point. In the career, you did not exit because the years already invested had calcified into something that felt like possession, and walking away from them felt like having those years subtracted, not like freeing the remaining ones. In the argument, you escalated not because new evidence arrived, but because conceding a position felt like a loss, and the threat processing circuitry had already been activated. An activated threat processing circuitry does not naturally defer to cost-benefit analysis. In the investment, you declined because the possibility of losing $200 outweighed the possibility of gaining $400, even when the probability structure favored the gain. The $200 had already been encoded as something that could be taken. The $400 had not yet been encoded as anything. The downstream of this asymmetry is not abstract. Individual investors who manage their own portfolios demonstrate a statistically documented pattern of holding losing positions and selling winning ones, a behavior called the disposition effect, and it correlates with measurable underperformance relative to the market. The organism is not making rational calculations that happen to be wrong. It is running a loss avoidance program that was never calibrated for financial markets. In health contexts, the difference between survival framing and mortality framing in treatment acceptance produces real divergence in patient decisions, which produces real divergence in outcomes. In relationships, the documented behavioral pattern shows that fear of loss frequently accelerates controlling or possessive behavior, which then increases the probability of the loss the organism was attempting to prevent. The mechanism generates the condition it fears. In negotiation and conflict, loss aversion escalates disputes past the threshold where either party can access functional cost-benefit reasoning, not because the stakes have grown, but because the framing has shifted from gain-seeking to loss protection. And loss protection circuitry does not negotiate. It defends. None of this is a malfunction. It is a design feature. The human animal that weighted losses more heavily than gains survived at higher rates in environments where losses were often irreversible and gains were often incremental. The feature was adaptive. It was selected. The fact that it now operates in contexts it was not selected for, financial instruments, medical decisions, corporate negotiations, is not a moral failing of the organism. It is an observation about the gap between the environment that shaped the architecture and the environment the architecture currently inhabits. And here is what is happening right now, in whatever cognitive space you are occupying while receiving this. Some part of the mechanism that was just described is currently processing this information as a potential loss, because accepting it fully means that prior decisions, the ones made under this asymmetry, were not as freely chosen as they felt at the time. That recalibration is itself registered as a loss. Something is being subtracted from the account of the self. The architecture doesn't distinguish between financial loss, relational loss, and the loss of believing you have been the author of your own choices. It applies the same asymmetric weighting to all of them. The mechanism described in this video is the mechanism currently processing the description of itself. The loop is not a metaphor, it is the structure, and it is closed.